Hi everyone. Today we are kicking off this exchange event by considering why well-being is an important concept to be considering in and beyond Welsh social care. My name is Dr. Jen Lyttleton-Smith and I'm a lecturer at Cardiff Metropolitan University, recently of Cardiff University, and I'm also a childhood sociologist who has spent the past few years examining how the Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act has affected child and family social services with regard to well-being and participation or co-production. Joining me today is my colleague Dr. Pippa Anderson, currently working with Bangor University. Pippa is a health economist by background. She's interested in how economical concerns drive high-level policy decision-making around health and social care. Together, we've been co-leading the evaluation of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act for the past few years, in collaboration with colleagues from multiple other universities around Wales. And we've had specific responsibility for assessing the significance of the concept of well-being within the Act, and how this has impacted practice approaches and public experiences of Welsh social care since the Act was implemented in 2016. I'm going to be starting us off today considering the broad issues around well-being. Pippa's going to come in later on to specifically discuss the economic aspects and measurement of well-being within policy. I'll then be back with you to think through some issues specific to Welsh social care and to share some preliminary data and thoughts from the evaluation of the Act. So, well-being is a contemporary concept that has entered the public consciousness and conversation wholeheartedly over the past decade. Sometimes we think about it in terms of wellness, a word that sparks Instagrammable images of yoga poses and vegan avocado and quinoa salad. Other times we think about it in terms of mindfulness or self-care, the rituals of sleep hygiene, walking meditations, and low-key personal pampering that many of us have tried to incorporate into our daily routines to try and cope with the pressures and pains of modern life, particularly during the high-stress era of COVID. In our particular sector of social care, we may also associate it with trauma recovery or the development of healthy relationships. So, well-being is a word that carries a lot of meanings, depending on its context and who is using it. However we interpret it, well-being is considered a universally positive word, indicating care and regard for oneself and those around you, and even extending out to our environment and the wider social world. It is aspirational. This is supported by its frequent juxtaposition to the concept of achievement. To achieve good well-being, this is a matter of personally striving to be the very best person you can be, to get the most out of the life that you have, and be a force for good through the enviable calm and strength it grants you. But perhaps most significantly, it is a word that inherently places responsibility on the individual to be well, that suffix of being implying that wellness is a personal activity of the self, primarily driven internally, rather than emerging in experience as an outcome of external factors and inputs. This is coherent to some degree with contemporary social care and health policy, which highlights prevention and personal action as the preferred strategies compared to late-stage intervention and prescriptive provision in improving well-being in society. However, this is not entirely coherent with the way that we currently measure well-being, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in a few minutes. As a concept in public services in the UK, well-being has been remarkably successful in winning over policymakers to centralise it within recent legislation and guidance. Initially confined to health-based policy and guidance, well-being now makes it into multiple core legislative acts within the UK. In Wales, the concept of well-being headlines two key governmental acts introduced in the mid-2010s. So obviously the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, but also the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So it is pertinent now for us to be clear as a society, and in particular as professionals in the social care sector, what the implications are of locating well-being as the core aim of our work and the improvement of such as a measure of our success as a sector. The problem we have around well-being, however, is that conceptual blurriness it carries with it. If a word can be applied so generally, with so many different interpretations of precisely what it is referring to, this can be problematic in a policy context. It begs the question of what we are really aiming for in social services. What is the balance of responsibility between individuals and professionals for delivering well-being to the people we work with, and what kinds of intervention and prevention strategies it supports? Importantly, when we set aims for public services, we have to be able to measure progress towards those aims to determine the coherence and the success of their associated policies and guidelines. And we cannot measure what we cannot define clearly. If we are not clear regarding the meaning and implications of well-being, then there is a risk that the concept becomes an attractive and compelling chimera. It purports to be all things to all people, representing universal goodness without any clarity about exactly what we are discussing. This universality might be useful in encouraging us to align ourselves with the values of Welsh social care policy. After all, who among us is going to stand up and say they have no need or concern for positive well-being? But this uncertain blurriness in definition could also leave well-being open to potential misuse, misdirection, or simply an incapacity to understand what difference social care strategy and policy makes in society. So Pippa and I have spent the past few years over 2 separate research projects, investigating what academics, professionals, policymakers, and members of the public involved in social care believe well-being to be and how it applies in a social services context. We've tried to understand what work the word well-being is doing in relation to social care, and whether its application in this legislation is actually making a difference to practice and in people's lives. So today we're going to draw from our work within the evaluation of the Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act to talk about how well-being rose as an important concept in UK policy when it comes to understanding and measuring this welfare and the success of the national populations. We'll talk about the challenges this has produced, in particular the debates over what kind of well-being we mean, and the various approaches regarding how this should be measured. We'll then look more closely at the Act itself and the Welsh Government's current approach to the implementation and measurement of well-being focused social care policy. We'll also consider how people accessing social care services and senior social care professionals in Wales are interpreting well-being in practice, and discuss what difference the concept is actually making in Welsh social care practice. And finally, what work we believe needs to be done in order to ensure its use supports improvement and progress in a measurable way. So to start us off in thinking more deeply about well-being, I want to just give us a whistle-stop tour of recent conceptual approaches to well-being. Now, up until about 15-20 years ago, well-being as a concept was quite boundaried within health-based discourse, and in health it referred to quite an individualized understanding which incorporated a holistic view of a person's physical and mental health. Since it's been taken over into social care and more collective understandings of what well-being might mean, we've broadened out into kind of community-based interpretations, even thinking about this on a national level, and Pippa's going to talk about this in a minute. But relationality has come far more into well-being over the past 15 years than it previously was. But when we actually think about well-being in that collective community-based way, there's still different interpretations that one can place upon the concept. And the 3 key ones are as follows. So some academics, researchers think about well-being in terms of happiness. So this is thinking in a hedonic way, or a way that makes us consider what's personally pleasurable to the individual. And this is a highly subjective interpretation of well-being. Only an individual person can truly say whether or not they are happy, whether or not they are experiencing enough pleasure in their life. A different conception of the word is to think about it in terms of life satisfaction. Now, this is particularly relational in terms of interpretations. We think about life satisfaction by comparing ourselves to those around us and considering whether or not we are satisfied with our lot compared to Bob down the road. It's also subjective in that it relies upon the individual's own interpretation of their emotions around the satisfaction with their life. However, it broadens this out to something that can be experienced as a community and that links directly to a local culture in wherever in the world you are looking. Then finally, and this sits quite separately to the other two, we have quality of life. And we can think about this in terms of eudaimonic well-being, opportunities to engage in activities and things in which we like doing, but also a good standard of living. So things like housing and education, financially, these are all of a standard that would be considered a good quality of life. We can refer to this as a components approach. So you can think about quality of life as different domains of existence, your health, your education, your finances. And by measuring those, quality of life gives you a measure of well-being that is both externalized, so dependent on factors external to the individual, and ostensibly objective. So you can measure it by these external factors without ever asking an individual whether or not they feel happy or satisfied. Each of these three different interpretations demands different considerations when we look at measuring well-being at a population level. And if we think about the different kinds of questions, the different framings we might put these three different interpretations through, then you can see what a difference it actually makes when we put this into practice. If you could consider your own answers to the questions, how happy are you today? Or how satisfied are you with your life compared to others around you? Or do you think you have a good quality of life? They each demand quite different answers, and you may have quite different narratives that you might produce in answer to each of them. What we're finding in our work through the different projects we've been researching on is that there is a tension between the academic evidence base and the approach that's being applied within policy. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but the coherence of the conceptual application of well-being within national policy is not necessarily fitting with the literature and research around well-being. And this has driven a lot of the work we've been doing as part of the evaluation of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. And you might question whether that matters. I mean, policy is a functional thing, right? It's meant to support the work of practice. It's not meant to be making high-level philosophical interpretations of these quite deep and quite blurry concepts that form fundamental aspects of human experience. But we would argue that it does matter, because the way in which you frame well-being in that collective, in that national way, says quite important things about the level of agency that we expect individuals to have in caring for themselves and those around them. It makes a statement about the level of power which we are or are not allowing people to have in society around their engagement with their rights and their right to speak to power, right to speak to government about the things that they want in society. And it also makes a statement about the level of responsibility that we expect individuals to take for the difficulties and the strengths in their lives. And particularly in social care, this is a very salient issue when it comes to designing preventative or interventionist approaches. Finally, I would argue that it's a question we should all be concerned about when we are thinking about working directly with people. Do we believe that well-being is a matter of purely subjective experience that's related to quite deep-seated personal experiences, perhaps trauma, perhaps early relationships, perhaps developmental challenges? Or are we simply products of our environment, and given the right external circumstances, can we all flourish and achieve really positive well-being? That's an important question, I think, for us all to answer. So that's a lot of different conceptual language, different interpretations of how we can think about well-being, but really, to simplify it all, it boils down to two different aspects of what we understand well-being to be. So we have objective well-being, which can be measured as an output of external factors in a person's life or a community's life. And if we measure the quality of those factors, then we can reach an understanding of someone's well-being. We can look at their housing, their education, their health, and come up with well-being as an output. But on the other hand, we also have well-being as a deeply personal, subjective experience that can't be confined to these external factors. And this is particularly relevant for social care because quite often the people we work with in various different services have incredibly disparate experiences, some of which involves trauma, some of which involves relationship disruption. And there are some things that happen in our lives that our external factors, our external experiences cannot mitigate or affect. So it's important that we keep both of these elements of well-being in mind as we move forward. For the next part of the presentation, I'm going to hand over to Pippa to go a little bit more deeply into how well-being arose as an important concept within UK policy. And then I'll be back with you in a few minutes to talk more specifically about Wales and how we are handling well-being as a concept here.
Well, my name's Pippa Anderson. I'm a health economist. I was until recently at Swansea University and headed the Swansea Centre for Health Economics, and I'm now supposedly retired, and I currently work for Bangor University and very shortly to be working for Cardiff University also. I've got a new laptop, and I found that on this laptop there are no pictures of me, but there's a very lovely picture I took at the end of last year, the place where I live, which is St David's in Pembrokeshire. So I thought I'd show you a picture of the sea rather than a picture of my rather mature face. I'm a health economist, which means that generally people expect me to be interested in resources, but I'm interested also very much in outcomes, and outcomes that relate to how well people are doing. And through that channel, it's very easy to slip into being very interested in quality of life and thereby well-being. And that's a very short story of how I come to be doing this presentation, because I'm involved in evaluation as a health economist of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act and its impact in Wales. So I'm counting resources, but I'm also looking at wellbeing outcomes. So that's me, and my contribution to this talk is really to give you a little bit of an overview about how economists got to be interested in wellbeing and what their contribution or otherwise has been to influence measurement of wellbeing, and then give you a little run through of how it's being done at national level for government purposes at the moment. Let me read these words to you. Well-being, happiness, economists, gross domestic product and UK government. How on earth are these words connected? Well, actually, in certain context, these are strongly connected words. Start with GDP. Gross domestic product, GDP, has been established a long time as a standard measure of, well, how well a country is doing and a proxy for welfare and well-being, until research by Richard Easton revealed that well-being did not rise in line with GDP. Let me read you the OECD definition of gross domestic product. So this presentation is guilty, as many are, of using acronyms, but I think it's probably important just to be sure that we're describing GDP, gross domestic product, in a way that we all are comfortable with. So I went to the OECD for their definition of GDP. And it was quite interesting to look at their definition. It's a measure of value created through production of goods and services in a country during a certain period. So it is a good indicator of what the country is churning out from production and what's spent on final goods and services, less imports brought into the country. But they do, as an organisation, make this important point that whilst GDP is the single most important indicator to capture economic activity, it falls short of providing a suitable measure of people's material well-being, not subjective well-being, for which alternative indicators might be more appropriate. And also these last 2 points refer to the fact that GDP is it's an index that tries to put countries on the same playing field and uses US dollars or US dollars per capita in terms of purchasing power parity, PPP. And all the OECD countries compile their data according to an established system. It's good for a snapshot cross-sectionally, but it's less suited for comparisons over time, as developments are not only caused by real growth, so improvements of GDP, can also be boosted by changes in prices and in purchasing power parity. Anyway, all that aside, I think it's notable that GDP is not recognised by OECD as a suitable measure of well-being. So this disconnect between well-being and GDP as an indicator of how well a country is doing came into the media headlines quite dramatically in 2010 when the UK Prime Minister David Cameron announced that a new wellbeing measure developed by the UK Office for National Statistics would be used to better understand the state of the nation. And Cameron's government suggested that the measure of the country's wellbeing would be a better reflection of how people are doing than economic measures like GDP. This was soon reported in the media as the PM's happiness index, but actually it reflected the groundswell of opinion and some evidence from economists going right back from Easton and others since that 1974 paper, who are really pushing for happiness or well-being, not the same thing necessarily, to be used as an indicator of how well a country is doing. And as an aside, I believe Bhutan has used this as an indicator for a very long time. So, good for David Cameron, you might say. Well, you might say good for David Cameron, but good for him for listening to all these economists. And Richard Layard made a very powerful case for measurement of subjective well-being. We use the acronym SWB in an article in Science in 2010. So I'll skip the preamble, but to get to the nub of it, we can get much better measures of benefits of a policy change through direct measures of subjective wellbeing. It's therefore time to begin developing an alternative system of cost-benefit analysis in which the units are units of subjective wellbeing. So I think Layard here is saying it's not only a replacement for GDP, that actually it's a grassroots level. Whenever policy is implemented to create change, that well-being should be the measure of outcome. So with this very high-profile backer, as an individual, David Cameron, also the government, quite a number of economists rolled up their sleeves and started thinking about using well-being. And a health economist, Paul Dolan, who drifted over into well-being as part of his research and interest, and Metcalfe published a paper in 2012 in response to the need to measure well-being. And they published a great paper which has systematically gone through what well-being is considered to be by different communities, different theorists, going right back to the Greek philosophers. And they reprised three main concepts of that were published in the subjective wellbeing literature that they found. And they said that if you want to evaluate the impact of a policy, you need to measure life satisfaction. If you want to understand how people are experiencing their lives right now, momentary mood, then there's a different way of measuring and use tools to measure. And then if you want to measure well-being as within the concept of eudaimonia, living a good life, having purpose, then there are other ways of measuring it. And I've got a table there's no way you'll be able to read on the screen, but might be useful to you to follow. So Dolan and Metcalfe, having split subjective well-being into three rough areas depending on the purpose of measuring subjective well-being, they suggest that policymakers should seek to measure all three areas of well-being. And they, in the paper, they provide some very concrete recommendations about what questions could be used in surveys mapped to these three concepts, and also made a very good point that particularly when it comes to people who receive social care, you need to be able to present your instruments and capture rating of subjective well-being by those least inclined to take part in surveys, and I'll perhaps add to that those least able, and those who don't get sampled by the big national surveys. So I'll show you the table and then let you digest that in your own good time. So here's a table I don't think you'll be able to read very easily as I'm talking at all, but I hope you'd like to go back to look at it. In fact, I'd encourage a read of the paper. But you see here in the paper, in the table, on the second row, experience measures. This is where you're sort of getting at happiness, or the opposite of happiness. Here it's worry. And so whilst happiness and well-being by some economists seems to be used interchangeably, it is perhaps a domain or a concept which is related only to experience. So governments are using different objective and subjective indicators to measure subjective well-being or happiness, which seems to be used interchangeably but not appropriately. So subjective indicators, by that I mean happiness, positive emotion, engagement, meaning, purpose, life satisfaction, achievement and competence, and that's measured using surveys and questionnaires. Happiness is and has been measured by simply asking people how happy they are, though these surveys do lack constructability. It's unclear what criteria different people might use when assessing their own happiness. And we do know some folk who find happiness in a grain of sand and others who need quite a lot more. But nationally, life satisfaction is the most common measure of well-being used, and it's used in the UK ONS surveys and the surveys that relate back to that in devolved nations and by different bodies. And this is the aforementioned Cameron Happiness Index. Let me, on the next slide, just show you what it is the ONS ask of people. So it's interesting as I go through these slides and go back to source material, how well-being is named slightly differently. So it's a happiness index, it's subjective well-being, and actually the UK Office for National Statistics, the ONS, introduced these questions and they call it personal well-being. And they introduced these questions into the annual population survey, the first one being in April 2011. So 4 questions on what they call personal well-being have remained unchanged ever since. So the questions are: overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? Overall, to what extent do you feel that things you do in your life are worthwhile? Overall, how happy did you feel yesterday? Overall, how anxious did you feel yesterday? And the scales run from 0 to 10, where 0 is not at all and 10 is completely. In Wales, quite a number of different bodies use exactly these same questions, or they from the ONS survey. I'm just taking a sideways step now and considering whether measuring determinants of well-being is also worthwhile. 4 main factors have been proposed to be important in influencing and determining subjective well-being: income, employment, social capital and health. That's what Stutzer and Frey in 2012 thought. And as an aside, I'll mention that between 2010 2013-14 there was a frenzy of economists and their close relations getting stuck into what they thought should be done and could be done about measuring well-being and what it all means. And a lot of measuring of determinants of well-being was implemented as well. But Dawn and colleagues way back in 2005 showed that in cross-country studies, income, health, human rights and social factors had little influence on subjective well-being, which seems a little counterintuitive perhaps. That aside, it's possible that all the different polls and surveys that are being used are not covering all the issues that are important to people's happiness. And that was a conclusion Kenny and colleagues came to in their paper in 2011. So, even galloping through the very surface of the issues created by measuring well-being, from the perspective of government policymakers and those who are interested in how well a country is doing, it's fraught with complications. Whilst it's put forward as something good to do, is not within doubt, but different surveys and the different governments are measuring something related to wellbeing, but that something is potentially embedded in different series, different constructs. But yes, measurement of something can be accomplished, and that something is well-being in some sense. But is this measurement measuring the measurable, or is it measuring what's important to match the intent of policymakers? Is what's being measured truly a GDP substitute, taking regular snapshots of the well-being of the nation? And perhaps more parochially, importantly for us, is it possible using these surveys to measure the performance of social services and people who receive care and support from those services? I'm not at all sure. What do you think?
It's Jen again, and thanks to Pippa for covering how well-being came to rise to such significance within UK social policy and the complexities of measuring it at a national level. I'm going to move from that now to think specifically about how the Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act of 2014 has used well-being as a central concept and what that might actually mean for our practice in Wales. So I've spent quite a lot of time looking at the Act and the way in which it uses well-being within the legislation and within the associated guidance. And there is no doubt that the well-being of people accessing social care is most certainly at the heart of the Act. The sticking point is how the Act actually defines well-being. And there is very little definition within the Act itself. Instead, it refers to the National Outcomes Framework, or the NOF, which is what it's frequently referred to as. If you're not familiar with this document, it's essentially a list of different aspects of life, which Welsh Government has taken as a definition of what it means to have positive well-being. The NOF essentially takes what we call a components approach. So by listing these various different domains and assessing their quality in an individual or a community's life, we therefore can make a statement about the level of well-being that this person or community has. You've got the list here in the green box. This is the full list of the different domains of well-being within the National Outcomes Framework. Securing rights and entitlements, physical and mental health, protection from abuse and neglect, education, relationships, contributing to society, social and economic well-being, and the suitability of living accommodation. The first problem that the NOF has is that it's tautological, i.e. that it describes what well-being is with reference to the concept of well-being. That may not seem like a huge problem, but if you say well-being means well-being, which is essentially what two of these domains do, emotional well-being and social and economic well-being, then you're still escaping exactly what that might mean. And I think it's no coincidence that those two domains, which have that tautological interpretation, are actually the most subjectively interpreted elements of the NOF. They're the aspects of well-being that are most individual for a person. The other important thing to note about the National Outcomes Framework is that the domains have been designed to be measurable by external factors. It doesn't talk about someone's feeling of happiness, satisfaction with their life, for example, questions which we'd need to approach individuals to answer. Instead, if you look at the exact wording, we're able to measure success in the National Outcomes Framework by examining data that might be gathered around individuals rather than from the individual itself. And in this way, it focuses on objective measurements of well-being rather than subjective measurements of well-being. This takes us back to my earlier slide, where we think about objective well-being versus subjective well-being and how important each different element is to a holistic understanding of what well-being means to an individual, to a community, to a society. And the National Outcomes Framework is very much in the former camp, the objective well-being camp. But these, in the conceptual literature, are equally important. To measure one without the other is not consistent with the evidence for using well-being in a national policy approach. So this is a bit of a problem for the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. So now that we've looked a bit further into how the Act interprets well-being, let's think again back to those two different aspects of well-being that are really important when we're thinking about it in terms of a social or relational concept. We have eudaimonic well-being, the relational and social aspects of well-being, such as access to rights, a contribution to society, access to positive activities in education and work, and it converges with the related concepts of quality of life and our living standards, such as our housing and our healthcare. But then we also have hedonic well-being. These are the emotional and embodied aspects of well-being, pleasure and enjoyment. It converges with psychological or mental health concepts of happiness and life satisfaction. And it's currently characterized as subjective well-being, so it's measurable only by an individual's own assessment, rather than by evaluating contributory factors like living standards. And as a reminder, these two elements are interactional. They feed into each other and they cannot stand alone as a measure of well-being. Let's think back to what Pippa was saying about measuring well-being in terms of broad population for policy purposes. There are two dominant models evident in the literature on well-being that have been applied. There's the components approach and the capabilities approach. The components approach is the current dominant discourse for well-being at a policy level, and it's the model that the Act and the NOF have applied. It breaks well-being into a series of components or independent elements as sort of commodities for an individual to achieve. Policies based on this approach seek to enable people to attain these components to enhance their personal well-being, such as positive relationships, good health, work, leisure, financial stability, and education. This approach is not relational or situated. It is resource-based and proposes that through the generation and provision of resource, well-being can effectively be produced as an output through governmental design. But this components approach has faced a really strong challenge from researchers, arguing that looking at well-being is far more complex, far more relational and subjective. And we cannot eliminate the personal experience in order to understand well-being as a concept. And Amartya Sen gathers these arguments together in the capabilities approach. Now, this approach claims that well-being can be assessed by understanding an individual's capabilities to do or be something, and argues that individuals should be evaluated within the context of available and feasible opportunities that they can choose to take up, rather than their achievements. And the uptake of these opportunities are described as the essence of a flourishing life, flourishing well-being. And there's just a quote from Sen, which I want to give you, which really nicely summarizes the value of the capabilities approach and describes how it differs from a components approach. In contrast with the utility-based or resource-based lines of thinking, individual advantage is judged in the capability approach by a person's capability to do things he or she has reason to value. A person's advantage in terms of opportunities is judged to be lower than that of another if she has less capability, less real opportunity to achieve those things that she has reason to value. The focus here is on the freedom that a person actually has to do this or be that, things that he or she may value doing or being. The things we value most are particularly important for us to be able to achieve. But the idea of freedom also respects our being free to determine what we want, what we value, and ultimately what we decide to choose. The regulation, therefore, of what counts as well-being by these preset criteria as seen in the Act and the NOF is quite a problematic matter for us to resolve when we're looking broadly at the application of well-being within Welsh social care. Clearly, Welsh Government have a need and an obligation to set measures to understand whether the introduction of this concept is achieving impact and improvement in the lived experiences of people accessing services. However, the underlying evidence base for actually using well-being within policy shows us that the criteria they have set out to do so are problematic in that they are incomplete by overly focusing on the eudaimonic aspects of well-being and not enough on the hedonic aspects of well-being. Amartya Sen gathers these arguments together in the capabilities approach to well-being. And this approach argues that well-being can be assessed by understanding an individual's capabilities to do or be something, and that individuals should be evaluated within the context of available and feasible opportunities, rather than their achievements. The uptake of these opportunities is the essence of well-being and a flourishing life. A quote from Sen which really nicely summarises the value of a capabilities approach and how it differs from a components approach is as follows. This is taken directly from Sen 2009. A person's advantage in terms of opportunities is judged to be lower than that of another if she has less capability, less real opportunity to achieve those things that she has reason to value. The focus here is on the freedom that a person actually has to do this or be that, things that he or she may value doing or being. Obviously, the things we value most are particularly important for us to be able to achieve. But the idea of freedom also respects our being free to determine what we want, what we value, and ultimately what we decide to choose. I think what this passage really highlights is that deeply personal interpretation of individual well-being, of emotional embodied well-being, which, as we've seen, is somewhat absent from the criteria set within the National Outcomes Framework and the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. If the capabilities approach, as is suggested by the literature, is indeed an improved understanding of well-being that can be applied meaningfully within policy, then the criteria that we see within the Act is somewhat problematic. And we would argue that Welsh Government have a need to develop the measures that have been set within the National Outcomes Framework to accommodate better that individual, personalised, emotional and embodied well-being that we see in the capabilities approach, that still prioritises agency and freedom, but also doesn't purely set external quality of life measures, living standards, as the criteria by which to understand whether or not the Act is having any impact on well-being. Unless this progression, this development takes place, then the literature suggests that the Act's current understanding of well-being is overly simplistic and incomplete. To finish off our presentation today, I just want to share a bit of the data that we've gathered as part of the evaluation of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, focusing on how people involved with social care, both members of the public and also professionals, how they understand well-being. And to start off, I'm just going to summarise some of the points of the conversations we had with people who are accessing social care services. And what we actually found is when we discussed the different dimensions of well-being outlined in the National Outcomes Framework, we found a broad alignment from individuals with the different aspects listed. That is not to say that people did not feel that there was more to their well-being than that. However, they did broadly agree with the different aspects of quality of life, living standards, and rights and freedoms that are listed. Something that's particularly important to highlight is that people felt quite often that the what matters conversation that had been had with them by a professional was a really important moment in managing their well-being. And to summarize some of the responses around this, it was that sense of being seen by a representative of social care and receiving that relational connection with that professional that emerged as particularly important to people when thinking about how social services had supported their well-being. We also found some areas of well-being that were not accounted for within the NOF. And these were quite important, in particular to some individuals. One of these was accountability. So when people were recipients of a discussion with social services around their needs and what kind of support or intervention or prevention services they might require, often this was quite hopeful for them. And when this was inadequately followed up by the professional or by the service, this could lead to quite a negative impact on their well-being, a sense that they had been hoodwinked or misled about what social services could actually do for them. So we felt it was important to consider how accountability could be merged into the NOF. Secondly, relationships with professionals beyond the what matters conversations was really important, particularly to children and young people, but also older people as well. The quality of these relationships with professionals, the level of trust that they had, and the impact on their well-being is something that isn't really captured within the NOF specifically, and it emerged as so important to the people we spoke to that we do feel it's worth considering including within our criteria for well-being in terms of people accessing social care. Interestingly, the final addition that we found was that people responded differently to the onus on personal choice, personalised social care, things like direct payments, where we kind of assume that every individual wants a level of personal control over exactly how their care is delivered and managed. But actually we found that quite frequently people struggled with this in terms of their well-being, and some people found it quite stressful to need to be involved to the degree that they were around decision-making for their well-being. And this raised to us the question of whether this wholesale transition to personally managed social care is really a universally positive one for well-being, or whether actually people's well-being could be better supported by assessing on an individual level the degree to which people wish to have input and control over how their services are delivered. I'm going to turn now with conversations that we've had with social care professionals. And I've got a few different quotes here. I'm not going to read the quotes, I'm going to summarise them, but do feel free to pause and have a read before you move on. This first slide, we see the difficulties in understanding and interpretation that some of the professionals we spoke with have experienced in relation to applying well-being within their work. We can see practitioners grappling with the complexity and intangibility of well-being as presented within the Act. And again, I would emphasise this is a really important challenge because difficulties and differences in the interpretation of core policy concepts can really hinder the uptake of innovation, particularly within partnership working, as different organisations may take different interpretations that are suited to their own needs but not necessarily to those of the other agencies with whom they work. This is illustrated by the first extract here, which raises the potential danger that framing this flagship Welsh policy within such broad and interpretive terms risks a lack of ownership within social care and therefore risks its capacity to deliver its core principles. In the second extract, we see a safeguarding officer raising the importance of subjective interpretation. And I'd argue that the struggle they're experiencing and describing here is occurring precisely because, instead of recognising and promoting the importance of subjective experience to well-being, the Act has in fact obscured it. These extracts show just how important it is to grasp a conceptual coherence around well-being and achieve a definition and measurement criteria that resonates with the public interpretation and lived experience of well-being, and which fits with the literature that we've discussed here today. While the confusion that we saw on the last slide is concerning, we've also had some really positive responses to the way that well-being has been implemented within Welsh social care. One of the strongest things that's really come through in our discussions with social care professionals is to the degree to which the holistic, multi-dimensional approach to well-being that the Act does embody creates strong links between well-being and multi-agency or partnership working. And this was perceived by managers across third sector, social services and health, as you can see here. So that's a really positive finding when we marry together the focus on well-being and the desire to improve multi-agency partnership working. And it really supports the knitting together of these principles to form a really strong platform for development and progression in the sector. And again, on this slide, we see another strength of the well-being approach embodied by the Act. The degree to which it is person-centred and co-productive and community-based has received a lot of support from professionals and does really demonstrate the value of a well-being focused approach to producing new perspectives and innovative approaches to delivering services. But I would say that there is a sense in my mind that what is being described here in these extracts is sort of basic good social work and good social care as it always has been. This isn't a bad thing. It shows that the Social Services and Wellbeing Act is in tune with how professionals identify the underpinning philosophy of social care and has effectively captured it in policy. But it does warn us to hold back from locating some of the well-being aspects of the Act as really strongly innovative and progressive. In terms of person-centred, community-based work, this is more back to basics rather than a brave new world. So to finish on something slightly more concerning, which kind of harks back to the blurriness around the concept and what the actual impact of that is for organisations. When we discussed implementation of wellbeing focused practice with organisations, there was a very common sense that actually, despite the Social Services and Wellbeing Act having been public for 7 years, actively implemented for 5, that wellbeing focused practice is still at the extreme early stages of being implemented. And as the second extract here shows, this is being linked to the indefinability of the concept and the uncertainty around it, and its relevance for what social care practitioners are actually doing. Now, I think we have presented some of the literature here which maybe provides some answers as to what direction we could go in next. But before I sort of talk about the future of developing wellbeing focused practice, I just want to summarise our overall findings as part of the evaluation of the Social Services Act. So, to summarise what we've been doing as part of the evaluation, what we've been talking about today, let's come back to that early question. What work is this word well-being doing in Welsh social care? What we've found out is that it does encourage us to think about the whole person holistically and their multidimensional experience. And this is really important in supporting a collaborative partnership approach to prevention and intervention. It also promotes the capacity of the individual to lead change in their own lives, to take that level of responsibility and exert agency over improving their experiences. But it doesn't necessarily account well enough for the differential impact of trauma and distress on people's capacity to act to support their well-being. We're not capturing those emotional, embodied, subjective experiences of well-being well enough to perceive how an individual might respond differently to the kind of inputs that social services are able to provide. And the danger of that is that it leads us to blame individuals for not achieving well-being, when actually the challenges they face lie beyond the current conceptual understanding and measurement that we're able to provide through the guidance, policy and measurement associated with the Act. We found positively that the Act and the NOF partially align with the evidence-based for national approaches to wellbeing policy. But we did also find that there was far too little attention paid to subjective well-being, and particularly in terms of measurement, we're simply not grasping that in any coherent way. And that's a big problem if you look at the literature, and something that really we believe needs to be corrected within the Act. Positively, we found that people accessing services do broadly agree with the National Outcomes Framework. But we did find some key missing aspects there. In terms of professionals, we found that the vagueness and the broadness and the lack of clear definition of well-being was problematic. However, well-being was also offering a number of benefits, particularly around multi-agency approaches and person-centred practice. However, we are still at the very early stages of implementing well-being in Welsh social care. And we really need to think now about how we push things on to the next stage. And that's going to take some active work, not only from managers and organisations, but from Welsh Government in terms of progressing the concept of wellbeing and its application within social care policy. So, to conclude, how can we move forward with wellbeing in Welsh social care and ensure that the headlining our national social services policy with this concept emerges as a really positive, progressive innovation within the sector? And I think we've suggested a range of different approaches to this today, and you'll no doubt have your own ideas as well, specific to your organisations and your area of work. Our key points are that we really need to be expanding our understanding of wellbeing within the Act, within the National Outcomes Framework, by looking at personal experience and subjective interpretations of individual well-being. We should not be looking at well-being purely in terms of objective external factors. And currently, that is the primary method by which the Welsh Government is doing this. We would argue that adopting a capabilities approach is more coherent with the conceptual literature than a components approach. And this does form a logical progression for the current Welsh model for wellbeing. So development in this area is going to be a simple and a positive step for us to take in terms of national strategy. We think there is a real need to tighten up the definition and ideally produce one that's non-tautological, that doesn't define well-being by calling it well-being. We need to look at the NOF and really account for subjective personal experience within that and make it usable by organisations to understand how the people they work with are experiencing changes to their well-being as a result of that work. We would also really like to see those points raised by the people accessing services who we spoke to, those points that they made that are not currently accounted for within the National Outcomes Framework. So this includes in particular public accountability, and relationships with professionals. And we would really like to see more attention given to the impact of assuming that people want a high level of personal control over the delivery of their services. This should be covered in assessment and taken on an individual basis rather than assumed. Finally, and most importantly, we really want to see a deeper level of measurement going on as a result of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. We believe it's vital that if we are producing well-being as the primary aim of improvement within social services in Wales, then we really need to be thinking more deeply about how we measure our progress towards this aim. This is work that we're going to be taking forward following the evaluation, and we're really interested in working with as many organisations as possible, local authorities, third sector, people involved in big data generation, and Welsh Government as well, of course, in terms of figuring out how we can start collecting subjective well-being data with people accessing social care services as a matter of routine, so that we're not just looking at the quality of housing or or access to healthcare and education, that we're simply asking people how they feel about their well-being on a regular basis and capturing that in a coherent, nationally standardised way. So that's the work that we're going to be doing next. That's everything we've got to say about well-being for today. If you do have any comments or questions, we will have a look through the chat after the talk. And if you have any personal questions that you want to ask us through email, please do get in touch. I've put our emails on the title slide, so you can go back to that and feel free to drop us a line. Otherwise, if you like to get involved in any of our future work around wellbeing and improving how we deliver this within Welsh social care, we are all ears and we'd love to hear from you. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the ExChange event, and thank you again from myself and Pippa.